Well, firstly, a big welcome to you all. My name is Daniel Ross, and I'm the founder of the Sports Business Syndicate. For those who don't know me, I'm going to speak for no more than a minute, and that's simply to thank, firstly, our esteemed panel for joining us, and also, of course, to thank you all for joining us to listen to what I know is going to be a very special discussion. I want to also thank Neelay Bhatt, co-chair and curator of TED Sports, and Jamie Kerr for initiating today in the first place. TED Sports inaugural event in Indianapolis this September is an amazing lineup of speakers and subjects, just what you'd expect from TED, and more of that later today for those who are interested in that. But if any of you, by the way, during the course of the discussion want to ask questions, simply post them in the chat and we'll do our best to include them as we go. For those of you here who aren't yet signed up to the Sports Business Syndicate, if you're a senior leader around the sports industry and you'd like to join our global community and more events like this, then please just message me at daniel@sportsbusinesssyndicate.com. I'll pop that in the chat, or you can reach us via your Luma invitation. And with that, let me hand the baton over to the ever excellent Mark Pougatch, who is your host and moderator today, to guide us towards plenty of ideas worth sharing. Over to you, Mark.
Dan, thank you very much. Thanks for joining us on this Sports Business Syndicate event featuring TED Sports. And we're here to celebrate and promote and debate TED's inaugural sports conference this September in Indianapolis. So Neelay Bhatt, as Dan says, is with us, co-chair and curator of TED Sports and founder and CEO of Next Practice Partners. James Kerr is a best-selling author of the book Legacy, about the leadership and culture of the All Blacks rugby team. He's an international speaker and a high-performance consultant. And Ed Smith, former England cricketer, former England selector, author and co-founder of the Institute of Sports Humanities. They've got a lot of experience and a lifetime in sport. Neelay, let's start with you as we're thinking towards your inaugural event next month. Why TED Sports? Why now? And what lessons are you looking to share from life stories that you think can be for the good of the community?
Well, thank you, firstly, for having me as well. It's great to be with everybody here from cloudy and not as sunny Indianapolis, but thankfully no rain like the UK right now. We've always had sports on the TED stages, right? As we've all seen and known, TED has been the platform for ideas worth spreading, ideas that have affected change all over the world. And many of them, as we know, have been through the lens of sports, from Serena Williams and Billie Jean King to Coach Wooden to the Pope. I mean, we've had people talk and reference even sports and fandom in so many ways. But as we know, sports is more than sports. It's about life, the lessons from sport with adversity, resilience, tenacity, courage, self-esteem, community building, all the rest that we know sports confers upon, that we've just never had an entire event at TED dedicated just to sports. So this is the first time ever. I want to give a shout out to Jamie Kerr, who is a member of the SBS and has been one of our guest curators. He's the reason we're starting and I had this conversation to begin with. And so the thought with TED was, why not us and why not now? And reason Indianapolis was the place and is the place for the very first is the global sports ecosystem, right? So as you think of TED with technology, entertainment, design, there isn't one single area with sports. And as we know, sports is no longer about just teams and players and games and events. So this will span the entire gamut, from ideas around technology to movies to climate change. And I'm going to go through later in the conversation with some of the speakers and experiences. But Mark, it very much is the idea that connection matters, and there's no better place than sports to help people feel a sense of connection, to feel a sense of belonging, and to bring people together, right? And that's really what this is all about.
Ed, you've been on the pitch, you've been in the administrator's office, you've been a writer, you've seen all sides of the sporting world. Why do you think it is that stories in sport arguably break down barriers, arguably resonate in a way that most other bits of society struggle to?
Yeah, look, it's such a good question. I think the first thing to say is we've lived through an incredible period in sport where it's become more and more the central form of shared culture. think to my parents' generation, it was probably music. I think Leonard Cohen said in the 60s, music was the mode, and now it's sport. He said it in 1988, and probably since then, he's been proved all too right. I think a few things. One is that, I would not make any presumptions about what anyone else on this call or anyone else tuning in reads or finds, interesting on TV or listens to in music. But I would probably say they've got a good handle on the Wimbledon final or the Champions League final or whatever it might be. So I think as other forms of wider culture and entertainment have become atomized, sport has actually become, even more united and in real time. So we do so much in our sort of silos. We come together for those big sporting events, whether that's in the stadium, in that sort of tribal, unified environment, that quasi-religious space, or whether it's, together, with you taking us through a sports match live, Mark. So I think sport has become more and more the way we do things together, to steal and adapt a line from the art historian Robert Hughes. He said, train stations were the cathedrals of the 19th century. Well, I think today that's sports stadiums, isn't it?
Yeah.
Um,
I think that's right, James, isn't it? Because certainly from my standpoint, my working life, which is live sport on the television, live sport gets figures. This is obviously the UK, but I'm sure this is reflected globally in a way that nothing else does. Now, that's arguably because of the streamlining of television, now the streamers and so forth. But there is still, for whatever reason, James, give us your idea why, a collegiate sensation about big sporting moments that there isn't about very, we've got Oasis at the moment, maybe in this country. Maybe you could argue that's a little bit of that, but that's quite ephemeral. But every year there's a big sporting event which brings a country together like nothing else.
Yeah, and I think it builds on what Ed's saying. There's an atomized world, a social media world, streaming. Once upon a time, we huddled around a radio and we listened to the same radio show. Now we can listen to whatever we want on our headphones and be separated from each other, but sport happens in real time. And it is tribal, and it does have that ability to congregate and to bring people together and to connect people around a common story. And I think that's hugely powerful and hugely needed in a social dimension, more needed now than ever. Ed talked about cathedrals. That sort of sense of having something to believe in, and those stories that Neelay talked about. They're redemption stories often around sport. You look at, I don't know, David Beckham. Sent off in a World Cup, scores the goal that takes England through to the Euros. There are moments of tremendous redemption and hope. And we get to experience those moments together as a society. And those moments, those stories shape us, I think. So I think it's a very powerful phenomenon. I think the other thing I'd just add is there's almost a different dimension of stories, which is within the teams themselves. What does it mean to play for your country? What does it mean to play within a particular group? And that ethos, that sort of sense of belief and belonging, is sort of the other aspect, I think, of storytelling within sport, the kind of the inward and the outward, if you like. And if you get your story as a group within that group really sorted, it's meaningful, people have clear roles and goals, all of those kind of things, then that can be hugely important for performance. And I think there's a lot that we can learn about that in a lot of other domains.
Ed, I wonder what you think the reaction to the Lionesses winning in the last few days has meant for society in this country. Not the excitement of them winning, that's a given, but just the amount of people watching it, the amount of people celebrating who they are, obviously what their gender is. That's been a huge sea change in a decade of that. What does that say? Because that's another example of a good sports story maybe reflecting something about society.
Yes, and obviously you hinted it there, it's cumulative, isn't it? It's sort of, there've been other installments in this story, and then there are these moments when it leaps forward very quickly and gathers momentum, and obviously the victory at the weekend was one of those. And look, the most banal level, the fact that we were all together, my, two young kids, boy and a girl, my wife and I, we were watching women's sport. That didn't happen when I was a kid in the same way. It probably wasn't broadcast, so we can hide behind that excuse, but it also wasn't part of the norm. My sister was a very talented athlete, didn't get the support that I did, at our different schools and our different, pathways. So, that's clearly not going to be the case for my kids, and things have come on enormously. There's probably still a long way to go. In the same way in cricket, one of the things we've found with the 100, by staging women's games on the same day at the same venue as the men's game, you get that total experience and you get people enjoying both. And you get obviously some respects, some women's sport benefit from being distinct. And of course, sometimes they benefit from being part of the same platform. But it's just an area which shows how sport both reflects and leads, and sometimes the lag is a cause for consternation and disappointment, and sometimes, of course, there's grounds for excitement and thanks.
Ed, you're onto something. I certainly see the same thing here now as well, where women's sports is no longer a moment, it is a movement, right? And it is not turning back in any way. The way we're talking about the Lionesses, similarly in Indianapolis, and honestly in America, WNBA and Caitlin Clark is like the second coming of Jordan in the early years in some ways, but with women's basketball. We had the WNBA All-Star last weekend in Indianapolis. Mark, we had 17,000 people come to watch women play basketball. That has never happened before, right? The ratings are higher, the endorsements are higher. And Ed, you're right. I mean, some of it is the broadcast thing in the past. In fact, one of our speakers at TED is Google's global head of sports media entertainment and a former Olympic silver medalist, Kate Johnson. And she talks of when she won in Athens, how little coverage there was. And some of it is now the nature of the times where there are more people writing, more creators creating. And that's what I think in terms of as we look at responsibility as a society, as individuals do, it is for each of us individually to not only seek out but amplify these the same way. So when someone says Liverpool Football Club or Chelsea or the Mumbai Indians, they're not directly assuming it's the men's team. They're looking at it to say this could be either one of the two teams as well. And how much more we can then do, as I love what Ed said earlier, we both follow and we shape. I say this from our lens as an ethos is best practice is what the way we've always done things. And I think it's time to shed those and move to next practices where we're looking at sports and not having to qualify that as women's sports or men's sports, but just sports.
Neelay, on a business level, clearly the business opportunities for women's sport are still, to some extent, untapped, aren't they? Which is a great thing for the women's sport industry, because people are now wanting to be aligned with them, to sponsor them, to be involved with them. How do you see that from your point of view?
100% right. And when you see the biggest brands, Nike is all in as well at a significantly higher level than before. I think tennis showed the path many, many years ago with equal prize money and visibility. And you see some of the richest athletes in the world are ones who aren't even playing at this point with a Serena Williams and a Maria Sharapova or even a Naomi Osaka, right? I think we've shown the business cases, and now it's more towards both the teams and the individuals. The good thing, at least in the States right now, is this has gone from just the elite athletes to what the NCAA has done now with the settlement in the House with what is called name, image, likeness, the NIL, where now collegiate athletes can be paid as well for partnering with brands and entities. And so you have younger athletes who may not be the best in their field, but can have enough of an influence or impact where they can still commercialize their presence and their impact as well. So, as Anna said here too, there's more representation, there's more visibility, and now I think there's more agency among female athletes to make their participation in sports become a commercially viable decision. And brands see that, businesses see that, teams see that. So it's a great cycle, and it's got a lot more room to grow.
Well, that's sport as a connector across gender, if you like. James, I wonder what you think the responsibility of sport is to tell better stories, because you often hear about a sportsman or woman, oh, they're a role model for X, Y, Z. They didn't ask to be a role model. So sometimes that's us in the media or society imposing something upon them they didn't ask for. But is there a responsibility of sport to tell better stories in an intentional way?
Well, I think there is. I think, as you say, I think it could be unfair to put the weight of representation on young shoulders, in an untrained and difficult environment. And at the same time, the more professional sport becomes, the more professional with the requirements, I think. I think, playing back to the women's game, you have to see something to be it, and that representation and the visualization of something. And so particularly if you're at the threshold of a movement rather than a moment, I think there is a lot of scrutiny and a lot of cameras and a lot of comment and a lot of storytelling about it. And I think it is part of the job, but it's also part of the privilege, I think, of the job to be out there and proving what's possible. And again, back to, I think, Ed's first point, we're arriving in a more digital world, we're a more alienated world, perhaps a world filled with more anxiety and judgment and all of that. But sport's wonderfully analog. You actually have to get out there on the grass and play. You need to interact with people. And I think, increasingly let's not call it a responsibility, let's call it an opportunity for those who are participating in, environments that they're passionate about to go out and represent what's possible, represent what excellence looks like, represent all those lessons that Neelay talked about. So on one level, I think it's unfair. Humans are human and there are going to be mistakes, but on the other level, I think there's a tremendous opportunity for those who believe in the power of sport to go out and represent, I guess.
Ed, I'm guessing that, you shared dressing rooms with people, and obviously you stood by the nets when you were selector, watching people and thinking they don't mind that. They quite like the responsibility, and others were thinking, I didn't ask for this. I just need to try and get runs. That's all I'm trying to do.
Yeah, what did Charles Barkley say? I'm just here to kill them and let God sort them out later. And I think there's a splash of that in a lot of athletes that some people don't want all the stuff that comes with it. I have one, it's not a disagreement or an objection to the thesis about impact and about storytelling's for good, but it's a counter view. I would say with heavy emphasis, so long as there's authenticity, because sport is its own form of truth, isn't it? And a storytelling that's layered over the top of sport, which misleads or distorts or tidies things up too much, or has the default of always searching for some higher purpose, which isn't there, that gets into the realm of fraud and ultimately works against the real values of sport. To tell you, two stories, both relating to sort of my life in writing. One, when I was young, when I was playing, I was also writing books, and I felt that they were quite different people. And to some degrees, there was a degree of tension between those two people. So it's not all the same, and they owe responsibilities to different forms of truth, and they ultimately serve different masters, the writer, if you like, or the storyteller and the athlete. And then secondly, this question of like, what does sport tell us about things, and what does sport, reveal about the wider world? Well, I wrote a book called What Sport Tells Us About Life, which was not my title. And as every writer will tell you, it's the title you don't want that actually is effective commercially. And my publisher sort of said, you're having it. And I got this lovely letter from the playwright Simon Gray, and he said, it was very nice. And then at the end comes the kicker. He said, one thing, Ed, the title, sport is life. So it doesn't quite follow, does it? And of course he's right. And he was like way ahead of the title and to some degree the conceit of the book. The point being that sport is a form of revealed truth. And to some degree, what you have to do as an athlete, obviously you want to shape it. You're the agent of destiny, if you like. As the viewer, you have to almost just open yourself to that in front of you and try and have the richest response you can to it. And, to steal DH's Lawrence idea about rescuing art from the artist, as the critic or the journalist or the author, you have to sort of try and find the real thing and almost rescue it sometimes from the press conference where all the mischief and the spin can come in. And, we've all had experiences of watching sport. A little bit like reading a truthful and deeply truthful novel, i.e. not superficially truthful, i.e. based on fact, but actually revealing something essential about human nature. We've all had experience of watching sport where we thought we wanted one thing, and then actually it emerged that we wanted something else. I remember watching great tennis finals, Nadal, Murray, Djokovic, Federer, and we all have our favorites and whatever. But then if the guy really earns it, you end up seeing the truth of that too. and you connect with the contest at a deeper level, I would say, at a more truthful level than just I want something to happen. So I think we should be mindful that although sport does reveal a great deal and it's a well of practical wisdom, if you like, it's also its own form of truth, and it is what it is, and we can't move it around at our will as people off the field.
Can we get to the truth, though, Ed, of a sporting personality more today than we ever can, actually because of social media? Now, social media listen, we'll all have a view on social media, the ills of social media, but I would say the good thing about social media is because it's so hard to be an island these days because everyone's pointing a phone around, actually it's much easier to generally know, you've used the word already, if somebody is authentic or not.
Okay, well let me, I was a very sort of minor player, really. I retired at 30, only played a very small amount for England, so I'm only using this as an illustrative example. Over the course of a 13-year career, certain amounts written and said about you. The two most insightful pieces, the ones that I couldn't have written myself and were beyond the point of me liking or not liking, but just going, wow, how does he know that? Were both written by the same person with zero access. He doesn't need to know me. He's seen it. He's seen me play, and he says, this is you. And you may not like it or you may like it. I don't care, because I've got my insights and I'm backing myself. And they're the pieces I looked at and go, how do they know that? Like, I don't know. I'm not sure I like it or not, but it's just the truth. Now, therefore, I think the word I'm circling around skeptically is access. And the other word I'm circling around skeptically is the idea of, very cozy relationships between storytellers and athletes where they kind of like scratch each other's back to reveal something polished up, which gets revealed, it gets released into the ether in a sanitized way to fans. I think in actual fact, and I'd be interested to know James's view when he's been on the inside of teams, to some degree, there should be a coldness and a clarity about writing about sport, which is you have to, Mark, you'll know from all your experiences of great pundits and insightful writers on sport. They really go with what they sense is true, not what they're being told. They have to have enough domain expertise not to miss the dartboard. They can't just wander into a new sport and go, I sense this is true. Obviously they need the expertise. But I think, so in answer to your question, obviously social media creates great opportunities for athletes to speak directly with fans and to build those. Could be a force for good or ill, like any technology or medium, it can work both ways. But I think we also shouldn't lose track of the fact that athletes tell the truth most in their sporting exploits. That's the trace they leave. And then those whose job or interest it is to interpret that, most of the evidence is on the field.
Yeah, absolutely. Because, of course, this whole thing about access these days, it's not really access because it's so well managed, particularly the harder you get. It's so well managed. There's an army of PR people. There's quite often a sheet of questions you have to ask beforehand. So you have to, as the media person doing the interviews, you have to think, this is not really access. Don't fall into this trap. James, I'm going to come to you in a second about the All Blacks because it's so interesting. Neelay, you are nodding along there. What do you want to say on this?
Well, as much as the streaming world has changed the sense of collective experiences, there is something about the storytelling aspect where F1 had a renaissance, especially in the US, because of Netflix, right? And as polished as the quote unquote access was, it was still more access than one has ever had before, right? So this whole sense of peeking behind the curtain with tennis or F1 or whatever else, I think that's been a wonderful revelation in terms of added connection opportunities for individuals in addition to the teams as well, that as fans we've just never had before. Now the cell phones have created, to me at least, a very predatory environment where I feel like, and I'm not an elite athlete to know that feeling, but I wonder how many of them feel like animals in a zoo at this point with a phone pointed at you everywhere you walk in public, right? So that is the sort of the dark side of it. But I do like the access, however polished, that we've had because of streaming and documentaries and storytelling, that I've enjoyed, and something that I just hadn't imagined before. Building on just the story here as well, because James, it sort of connects to what you've written and talked about too. The power of sport in different ways. When I worked for the Athens Olympics, I got to be in the Olympic Village as part of the Olympic Village media and publication, and it was incredible to see 200 countries all together, tied because of the shared love of sport. Most of who could never make a living off sport, but they were there. But one of the most transformative experiences for me was watching the New Zealand Olympic team do the Haka in the Olympic Village, right? Watching that live for the first time. And it sort of reminded me, and still does, of the power of sport to also, in some ways, preserve what especially the All Blacks have done, preserve indigenous cultures like the Maori, which in the US or many other places, right, even Australia for that matter, has never been done the same way, right? So that was a really eye-opening thing to see at that time, well before access, of how much sport and that storytelling has impacted to shared language and shared customs that otherwise there aren't other places where one could have those experiences. So James, I'd love to hear more about some of those insights behind the scenes as well, to build on Mark's question too.
Yeah. Listen, I think spot on. I think there's two things, to say to that. One is just to build on Ed's idea around authenticity. Anyone who's ever been in the middle of a media storm knows that the reality is usually very different to the storm, and there is a disjunction. There's signal and there's noise. There's what's really going on and there's the noise all around it. And often, they're quite different things. I think Ed's point, there are different responsibilities to different audiences. One might be on the extreme clickbait or scandal or skepticism or whatever. On the other level, within the group, it's about performance. It's about turning up next Saturday and doing the job and so on. And so there can be two very different things going on. And you take the Haka, and usually it's when they play at Twickenham. The All Blacks come to Twickenham. Usually there's a scandal about the Haka. Should the Haka be allowed? All of this stuff, right, comes up, and it becomes a big kind of news beat that goes on. Is that relevant for the group? Well, not really, right? Because it's not even really discussed within the group. There is a right to do the Haka. The Haka, in fact, preempted the national anthems within rugby. The Welsh national anthem was sung in response to the Haka back in 1905. So it's part of that thing, and there is a sort of a right and a responsibility and a legacy around the Haka that is very powerful for that group. And I would argue the power is not in its performance outwardly, the storytelling, but it's the story they tell themselves when they perform it and the connection around that. But it also has this extraordinary power, the Haka. Neelay, as you say, in New Zealand, if you look at the history of the Haka, it was a travesty. It was like the black and white minstrel show for a long, long time. And then they got a grip on it and they wanted to create authenticity around it and do it properly. And they got wise men, Tawanga, in to work with the group, and they did it right. And it changed everything. Buck Shelford, Maori captain at the time. And I would argue that it changed the country from this kind of almost touristic view of the Haka and of Māoritanga and so on to an embodiment of what New Zealand Aotearoa is. And it was, I think, a watershed moment in that kind of cultural transformation of a country from a Pākehā white colonist place, Little England, 50 years behind, to a genuinely South Pacific country that owned its own identity. Yeah. And that was hugely powerful within the country and hugely powerful for the team. So that reciprocity, the purpose of the All Blacks is to unite and inspire the nation. That's the story that Haka tells in many ways. And the impact that it had has been immense within New Zealand. But also the transformation of the Haka was immense within that team because it embodied the identity of who they are, why they play, why it matters, why every game you have to win because you're either enhancing the legacy or you're not. So it's a very powerful embodiment, ritualization of a story that's impactful on many different levels. So I think it's a brilliant example of how storytelling works both within the group, but also within the community that group serves, perhaps, as a way of looking.
James, I think that's so interesting because I'd never thought of it that way before. Because with the greatest respect, and you would have seen this on social media, there's a Haka from the early 70s, and it looks like men Morris dancing.
It is.
It really does. They don't really know what they're doing.
Shameful. Looking back on it, it's pretty shameful.
Yeah. So as you say, it's part of, hand in hand in New Zealand being a modern, progressive, confident democracy in its own right.
Yeah.
Let's talk more about the All Blacks because you wrote that amazing book, Legacy, about it. You lecture on this. What can leaders learn from the All Blacks in terms of, you mentioned the Haka, so that's ritual, but identity as well, myth. What are the learnings, do you think?
Well, without kind of bigging up the team too much, they've been pretty successful over a long period of time. 125 years, notch under 80% win ratio. Wales last beat them back in 1953. Scotland yet to beat them. I don't want to go on, but they're hugely competitive.
We must have stopped you. It sounds like you do want to go on.
I could go on. I'll go. Actually, I will go on.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, yeah.
Hugely competitive.
That was
team,
fairly unconvincing. I mustn't go on.
Very competitive environment, but of course they're different players in the group all the time. The entity stays the same, but the team changes. And what holds all of that together? And I would argue right at the heart of that is story, is ethos, is that sort of belief system about what it means, to leave the jersey in a better place, that idea of legacy, to do what you can in your time in the team, the language, the symbol, the ritual, the black jersey, the haka. So that narrative, I think, is the sort of the glue and the oil that has helped maintain, and there are many other reasons, it's a rugby, it is a religion in New Zealand. It's a small country, but it's big enough. It's got a mixed demographic. There are a lot of good kind of functional reasons. But the meaning of what it means to be an All Black, what it means to pull on that black jersey and run out and represent, the story of the All Blacks, I think is an extraordinarily powerful and almost irreplaceable kind of force multiplier to all the talent that they have. And so I would say that culture as a force multiplier and therefore story, which I think is at the heart of culture, that ethos, the character of the group, if you like, I think acts as a force multiplier to their talent and creates the conditions for growth and expression and commitment and excellence and sacrifice and all of the stuff that makes a great team great. The 2 inches kind of above the hairline kind of thing.
And James, do we just have to take it on board? And Ed will smile at this. That inevitably, when people talk about an ethos and something which is so special to a country like the All Black jersey is, like the baggy green is the Australian cricketers, that there will be a time and a moment when the rest of the world goes, okay, we get it. Can you stop telling us how marvellous you are? And I mentioned the baggy green deliberately because we all know what the baggy green means to Australian cricketers. But when Steve Waugh wears it in the Wimbledon Royal Box, we go, okay, we get it.
Enough already.
Not because we're cynics or I'm part of the cynical media, but it's like, you know what I'm saying? There's a point at which you go, that's marvellous, and beyond it, which you go, okay, can you stop blowing your own trumpet now? Do you take my point?
I think the most powerful stories are the sacred, secret ones, actually. And I think sometimes the social media, the access that we've talked about, the revealing of those moments distills, weakens maybe sometimes that internal story, and sometimes it plays against you. When you, if you talk about humility as part of your culture, but you're, out there boasting about it, then, there's an inauthenticity that comes out of that, I think. And so I think that has to be managed, and I think it becomes awareness. I think it's part of the natural ebb and flow. And I think often it's picked up not by the group itself, but by the surroundings of the group. The pundits, sometimes the former players, as you pointed out, those who can make something of it. But the teams that do it great, what happens in the locker room stays in the locker room. And that's a very powerful, sacred social contract, I think, that can really bind a group.
Neelay, I want to come to you in a second about social change and climate change. Ed, what about your view on that? My mother had a brilliant expression. No one likes a show off, Mark. And there are times I go, okay, we know you're great. Could you just, Can you just pipe down a little bit?
My mum's variant on that was never,
Yeah.
no one likes people who wash their clean linen in public. You
Yeah.
know, it's like there's an element of, and I think, first of all, I think James's point is spot on that in very powerful leadership groups. So first of all, if you ask any coach, what's the key to his success? They'll probably give different answers in many respects, except one, which is nearly all of them will say, I had good senior players. I'm yet to see a team win without good senior players. And basically, I'm also yet to see a captain or a coach say, I did it all on my own. Nearly always, if they're honest, they say, you know what, I had 4 or 5 people. The problems never really got to my door because they sorted them all out. And you know what? They never told anyone. Half of the problems, I'm with John Inverarity, the great Australian captain and selector. He said, my senior players were so good, half the problems I never found out about, and he was known for being this great thinker. He said, talk to Ian Brayshaw, talk to Rod Marsh, talk to Dennis Lilly. He said, they just made all the problems go away. And he was, there's an element of modesty there, but also truth. I think the second thing is, and I think, Mark, what you're hinting at there is obviously there's strong culture in some teams, and James has brought that to life and given it an international readership. That's true. Some teams have a strong culture. It's also true that there's a danger then when you trip over into a self-regarding brand that actually you may become almost a caricature of yourself. And again, I've known people inside those great sport cultures, who've said, you know what, we're starting to believe it a bit too much now. Like I'm almost short our culture because, it's hard won, and, it can just go off the ball very easily. So while I believe, deeply in the power of symbol and mythology, and effective leaders are often great storytellers. They can convene movement around stories, and they can convene team dynamics around stories. All true. However, you got to be careful if you go too far and you start believing your own hype, and you let brand start to distort
Take
truth.
over almost.
Yeah, take over.
And it's that inside-outside thing in a way, and I think access and and I think that distinction is exactly right. There's kind of your ethos and there's your brand, and ideally they reflect each other, but they're not the same thing. And that ethos, I think, needs to be protected within a group, and that brand will be, marketed, and marketing tends to become increasingly inauthentic often, and misinterpreted and so on. And so there is always that tension between that authenticity and that kind of advertising, if you like.
Last point, just on that, Matthew Paris has this great line about PR. He said the PR industry doesn't understand public relations. He says, if you really want to have a good reputation, manage your reputation a little bit below where it warrants being. So in other words, people are always saying, actually, you know what, he's not as bad as all that. And of course, what the PR industry wants to do is to manage everyone's reputation sort of in excess of reality. And then, of course, the savvy observer goes, hang on a minute, I'm getting a bit annoyed about this. This is a little bit beyond justice. And
That's very canny. He's not that bad after all, I promise. Well,
exactly. Yeah.
2 words we've used today, which we wouldn't have used 10 years ago, which are authenticity and brand about sport. We didn't use those 10 years ago. And also on dressing rooms. Roy Keane always says, good players need good coaches. Great dressing rooms run themselves. And that's what you're saying. And that's what John Inverarity had. Run themselves. Neelay, we've had a question about the responsibility of sport when it comes to matters of social change and particularly climate change. And before you answer, football in Europe is all like, yes, we're going to do this. And then they have another European competition, which requires even more flights around Europe to play it. So sport, certainly in Europe, seems to say one thing and do another. What's your view on it?
So I think the word authenticity is used so often these days that it feels inauthentic when somebody says I'm authentic, right? It's become this same buzzword like innovation, etc. as well. So when I see some of these groups, and I have to say, spending half my life in India and the other half now in the US, there has been a lot more in terms of what stories were elevated. Very Western media driven still are, even in sports. It was, at the risk of an unpopular opinion here, the English teams have been significantly overrated for years, till Ed took over some of the leadership and they had their most successful time. They never won anything till the 2019 World Cup. And that also as a Kiwi, I don't know how you feel about that, James, but that's a discussion for another
Not very
day.
good. Still.
Yeah.
I hate to go on, James, but
Yeah. But
Well,
the
go
point
ahead
being,
then.
I think in a lot of places, it felt like the responsibility, not just of sports as sport, but even of sport media, was to elevate all stories, not the one that fit a narrative or perpetuated the colonial mindset or what people seem to get used to seeing. And I love how now India can say to a curator, screw you, I'm not going to do this. You do your job. We're going to play on or refuse to shake hands and get their centuries because you know if the tables are reversed, they would do the same. Right. So I think for more of these countries, more of these players to own that as well. And I think as a larger responsibility for sport, it's interesting. We talked about role models here. There was a very famous Nike ad in the 80s where Charles Barkley said, I am not a role model. Your parents need to be your role models. It was very controversial, right? And until date, there is certainly some of that with individual athletes, but 100% sport has to take a stand. And we've shown when it has changed society, right? And I'll tie it back to TED as well. For a couple of our speakers, one of them is Sam Ramsamy. And Sam grew up in South Africa, pre-apartheid. He's 87 years old. He was born even before apartheid was actually formally instituted. Lived through it, went into exile while working with Mandela to use, as we know, the boycott of South Africa as a way to help end apartheid. I mean, that is the power of sport to change the destiny of an entire country and a social justice movement, right? So Sam's going to be actually at TED Sports talking about how he led the Rainbow Nation in their first unified post-apartheid Olympic team in Barcelona 92. And it's not perfect by any means, but we saw the power of rugby as well. You know, exactly what happened when the Springboks won as well, and then and sort of
I'm not
the South
feeling
African
very
rugby
good
team
about
rather,
that
not
either,
Springboks, yeah.
despite
I
the
know,
change
I
that
know.
are part of that. But we'll come back to
Sorry,
that.
we're not rehashing your this is going to be like therapy for James. Is going to need therapy after this call here, but I think
James, if I just
those
say
were the
like,
power of sport. Yeah,
sorry,
yeah. No, so
I was
and
just
just
going to
one
say,
other
sorry
thing
to
on the
cut across,
climate
Neelay.
change part. Yeah, go ahead, Ed.
Yes. Yes.
No, I was just going to say, just as an aside, James, you brought up 1953 to a Wales
Yeah,
fan.
yeah.
Like totally, there's no
It's
sympathy. You're
all
just
on
having
me.
it
It's
from then
fine. I'll
on.
take it.
53 was brought up like
Yeah.
out of nowhere.
We
So
can go
sorry,
further
Neelay.
back.
Yeah.
Neelay,
See,
say
this is
something
the
but
power
about.
of sport.
yeah,
It's united through conflict. Sorry, Neelay, go
yeah.
ahead.
No. I think the question that someone posed was also talking of issues like climate change, right? And one would think in sporting conferences or something like TED, how does that even fit in? Or in general, one, I think, yes, there's definitely a stand to be taken. And two, Mark, you brought this up. I don't think that's always authentic because we have seen FIFA willing to move the World Cup window to fit what we know was definitely a dollar and cents decision too, with the World Cup in Qatar, for example, as well. Summer Olympics maybe in the future may not be able to be in places like India or Saudi Arabia to actually happen in summer. And how can we not talk about that, right? So one of the talks and the ideas we are elevating as well at TED is the former head of sustainability for the Rio Olympics, who is a sports climate researcher. And she's going to be talking about brand new research on the impact of climate change on ocean-based sports, right? How are we going to be able to use and access the oceans as well as we go forward with what we're doing, from winter sports and snow melting and not having access to skiing, to things being so hot to not even having the opportunity to play outside. These are the issues, whether we talk social justice, women's rights, immigration issues, apartheid, climate change. that 100% sport has to lead the way and take a stance. And the ones, I believe, the ones that do it better, and at the risk of now using authentically, but the ones that do it authentically, like the NBA did at times as well, they are the ones who will build true brand loyalty, true fan loyalty when things get tough. The rest will be exposed as purely financial money chasers.
Totally agreed. Totally agreed. You know, I think it comes down to that difference between authenticity, if we can use that word again, and marketing. You know, and people know. You know, if stuff emerges spontaneously from the DNA, if you like, of the sport, and you look at you look at taking the knee, for instance, a very spontaneous at the beginning, and in fact, kind of activist thing that became more and more it kind of normalized, if that's the word, or embraced, came out of something. You know, it wasn't pinned on the top of it because it flags a certain demographic, and I think fans, I think we know, you know, we can see the difference. But the real power of it is when it comes organically, I think, from the group and from the needs. You know, anti-racism in football, for instance, has come really out of people yelling from the stands, you know, stuff that is unacceptable. And I think then it's valid and relevant and resonant and a really good thing. I think when you paint a flag on something because it looks good in a marketing campaign, I think you've lost the game.
Yeah. The modern day consumer is very savvy. I think
Yeah.
that may be as much because of, you know, the blizzard of media now. They're very savvy. You can't pull the wool over their eyes very easy. I'm aware we've got about 10 minutes to go, so a couple more topics, and then Neelay will give you a chance towards the end to tell us who's going to be speaking and why we should be so entranced by TED Sports. Ed, would you give us a moment from your sporting life, or someone else's, but I'm really interested in yours, that told a story more powerfully than any words you could write did?
Well, I'll leave my life out of it, but I'll say the biggest and most profound shift in my lifetime in sport, regardless of the playing side, is that as sport has become hyper professionalized and has become better and better, so as it's become more close to the outer limit of our capacity as human beings, we've learned that the 1980s mantra, nice guys come last, is nonsense. And we've learned that the most powerful way to win is through joy. If you watch Carlos Alcaraz on match point, saving a match point, and you watch him smile and you watch him feed off the crowd and you watch him connect with the child in him, the boy that loved tennis, to me, that's the most powerful story about high performance. Because, you know, I was brought up to, you know, I didn't really get too into it myself, but the predominant culture was smash your racket shows you're a winner, snarl at the umpire shows you're a winner, talk down to your opponent shows you're a winner. They're looking shot to bits as philosophies and worldviews. And of course, athletes make mistakes, and of course, they lose their temper. I would certainly plead guilty to all of that. But in actual fact, what we found is that, you know, wanting to win and having a high degree of, you know, competitiveness, which has a dark side, we know in many people, most people perhaps, gets you so far. But in actual fact, true greatness, greatness that lives on in the memories of people who watch it and who share it in various ways, is often a much more optimistic and human story. We don't know what we can do when we actually connect with the parts of our character which are a bit less controlled, and I mean that in a positive way, less scripted, less sort of hamstrung by concerns about fear of failure and technique and all those things. And we actually get in touch with the very same person that first fell in love with sport in the first place. And to me, that has come through so strongly. Some incredible role models there, you know, across different sports. But you will often see athletes today, the very best athletes, enjoying those big moments more honestly and more transparently and communicating that joy to the outside world than was the case, I think, when I was growing up. And to me, that's progress, and more in step with what's best about the world.
You hear that, James, increasingly in my world, in the media world, when you're interviewing somebody and they go, I just need to get back to that boy or girl who fell in love with XYZ in the first place. And then once I do, I've got enough ability, I'll find my form again. That's
Yeah.
actually quite empowering because
It's hugely empowering.
oh my God, they're no different to me. They just happen to be a better batsman by miles. But there's still the same childish love of that game is what we're talking about.
Yeah. And, the word Ed used was love. And, in many ways to create the conditions in which we grow and we express ourselves and we feel safe. We have a secure base to go out there and be adventurous, to be enterprising, is really an environment of high performance. It's an optimum performance environment in many ways. And even the physiology of it is, the higher our dopamine, the more reward oriented we are. We talk about cricket and we talk about baseball. And, part of that element is, well, let's create an environment of optimism, of positivity, and so on. And I think we think about what we can learn from that and take into parenting, into teaching, into leading in business. It's a very, very powerful and important lesson, I think, that the harder you are, the more unrelenting you are with other human beings, it's a counterproductive force, but to create genuine human connection, an athlete-centered environment, a place in which the original word for culture comes from the idea the Latin root comes from Cicero, is to cultivate, to create the space to grow, and the same root leads to the word care, to take care of each other. And I think one of I call it the metrosexual managers. Once upon a time it was barking orders, the patricians from above, and now it's in there with the group, shoulder to shoulder. In terms of connecting people and pulling people together and creating that genuine human connection and that environment of care and compassion and, dare I say it, love and joy, because positivity breeds huge benefits in any environment. And I'd say, Ed, I think that's spot on.
And James, on that point, and welcome to our new panelists
Speaking
as
of
well.
love,
Yes.
There we go. Right on.
Speaking
Right
of
on
raising
cue.
kids,
Fantastic.
right? Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Here's the real intervention where this is the insight. I think to James's point, given that, you mentioned a little bit of Latin, I suppose if I have one theme in my life in sport, it's probably to rescue the word amateur from the kind of wrong side of history. And, to do something out of love is the essence of it.
Exactly.
And that's the very best of sport, I think.
Right.
But it's so interesting, isn't it? Because English professional football in the 90s is the best example that you'd only get the best out of somebody if you threw teacups at them, XYZ. And it didn't take long. It only took a decade. Go, no, if you put your arm around somebody, that's the way you'll get the best out of them. That shift actually happened quite quickly. And as you say, it's very much where we are today. Neelay, it's 5-2. We've got 5 minutes to go. So talk to us about next month and Indianapolis. There are lots of sports conferences. Why is TED Sports so different? Why should we all come to America instead?
Yeah, I will, and I just want to take the moment because of what they both shared on the lessons and the parenting and the kids and the changes, and unscripted, of course, as you clearly saw, my 7-year-old making an appearance, and a sign of how times have changed, right? I don't know if you all remember during the pandemic, there was this BBC interview and a child walked in the back, and it made such big news because people are horrified that how can an unscripted moment like this happen? And now we take it for granted. For the most part, people accept it. And for those who don't, I say, screw it. This is how I'm going to be, right? And that's the metrosexual mindset or whatever you want to call it. We've normalized that. And someone put in a question, which I thought also touched with this, with self-indulgence versus winning cultures and all the rest. And, Ed, what you mentioned with Alcaraz, I feel like he's modeled himself after Roger and Rafa, right? And they showed that you can be at the highest levels of competition and yet not be assholes and actually like each other. Like that didn't happen in that level of sport before. So you can be competitors and still be kind. And I feel like that's the shift that has happened where now, as I think of parenting, that's what I am trying to teach my kids, that you can play to win and you can still respect the opponent. You don't have to love them, but you can respect them. You don't have to hate people to beat them, right? And I feel like that's where another
Right.
piece where society can learn from sport, that we can disagree with people politically, but we don't have to hate them just for different views. And I know, Mark, you've got history with your grandparents and escaping with sort of the Jewish diaspora and all the rest. So I know you've seen and known that trauma over the years, and you're raising kids now. So as we see all of this, to me, that's sort of where, as we go with TED Sports, the kind of messages I want to be able to bring in for the future generation, for these, my 7-year-old going on 27, is that ideas change everything, right? And how do we bring forth those ideas? So at TED, we're not in the business of exchanging business cards. It is not a transactional conference. It's not a speed dating one where I can name drop my title and tell you my resume. It's talking of life. It's like what drives your curiosity, what creates authentic connection, truly authentic connection, in ways that you can actually look at leveraging those ideas for change. So when you see the TED Talks on stage, those are maybe 10% of an actual TED conference. What you see in the rest of it is really where the magic happens, right? At TED, everything is an immersive, inclusive experience. So your meals, your workshops, your activities, everything is part of the conference and they are actually curated. So, I know Kevin posted the link earlier. Would love for you to share the link as well. And we've got speakers from 6 continents coming there, from WWE superstar Triple H, talking of the storytelling behind WWE itself, to Gilberto Silva, right? Arsenal Invincibles, Brazilian captain, World Cup winner, talking of mental health in sport, to the world's leading dog agility trainer, talking of interspecies coaching, to the CEO of the Federation for Sports in Space, looking at what could this be 25 years from now, and could you actually have sports in space? These are just the talks among many others, but the other real game changer that I've always enjoyed at TED conferences is where one of our workshops is with Arrow McLaren, the IndyCar race team, and McLaren Racing themselves, talking about teamwork, but they will talk about that at the Indy Motor Speedway with the pit crew, talking of how the pit stop is the ultimate form of teamwork. And then you as an attendee get to do a pit stop yourself, right? Another one of them is with a Super Bowl winning kicker, talking of performing under pressure, but unlike doing this in a boardroom, he will do this in the locker room of an NFL stadium, after which you get to kick field goals at an actual Super Bowl winning NFL stadium. So those are the kinds of experiences and differences where James, we've talked about possibly teaching people to do the Haka, but we won't be doing it this year, but down the line. But this year we're going to have a group actually talk people through how dance is a form of athletic expression. But what the audience doesn't know is the group that's going to learn it, that is where they will actually get to go on stage and do a flash mob of a dance on a live TED stage with what they learned from the workshop. You don't do that at other conferences. So to me, that's the beauty, where I'm standing in line with Al Gore for coffee, having a chat with Tamika Catchings while standing on a basketball court, and then talking to Gilberto Silva about parenting and mental health and all the rest in ways that you would never otherwise have authentic access. So to me, I would say to everybody, if there is one conference you attend, and if you truly care about sports, this is where ideas, experiences, and genuine connections will all converge for the first time in the world. So would open invitation to anybody. If you are interested in knowing more, tell me and reach out. And then one last piece, because I've had so many people reach out to pitch for speakers and talking, is back to our idea of storytelling with impact. We all know this. The best storytellers are the ones where they are not the story themselves, right? And I find the best TED Talks are where you are not the talk, you are simply the messenger for the best idea. So when you reach out to speak and pitch ideas, make the idea, not yourself the idea.
Neelay, that's great. And we put on the studio chat, and we'll disseminate for everybody the link as well about Indianapolis. So it's on the chat now, on the everyone chat now, but we will make sure we do that. We've had our hour. So thank you very much for joining us wherever you may be. And thank you particularly to Neelay, to James and to Ed for joining us this afternoon. Bye for now.